Here is something that will change how you think about every meal for the rest of your life. And it does not require you to change a single thing you eat. It only requires you to change when you eat it. That might sound too simple to be meaningful, but in 2023, a team of French researchers published a study in the journal Nature Communications that followed 103,000 adults over several years and tracked exactly when each of them ate their meals, not what they ate, when, and what they found was striking. People whose last meal of the day came after 9 in the evening had a meaningfully higher risk of cardiovascular disease compared to those who finished eating before 8. And separately, people who ate their first meal of the day after 9 in the morning had a higher risk than those who ate before 8. The timing of eating, independent of what was eaten, was associated with cardiovascular outcomes. Before I go any further, one honest note that I want to say clearly. Everything here is general education, not medical advice. I am not your doctor, this is not a diagnosis, and nothing here should lead you to change a medication or skip a meal your doctor has specifically recommended. If you have a medical condition that affects your appetite, your blood sugar, or your digestion, please bring what you learn here to your own doctor. And stay with me specifically for the section on protein and muscle, because after 65, there is a piece of the meal timing picture that almost no one talks about, and it is arguably the most important one for protecting your independence. By the time we are done, you are going to understand why your body handles the same food differently at noon than it does at 8 in the evening. You are going to understand the specific reason this matters more after 65 than it did at 40. You are going to know what the research actually recommends with an honest account of where the evidence is strong and where it is still evolving. And you are going to have a practical, specific answer to the question in this video's title. Let me start by building the foundation, because once you see how the body's internal clock works, everything else will make sense. Your body runs on a 24-hour internal clock, not metaphorically, literally. There is a cluster of about 20,000 neurons in your brain in a region called the suprachiasmatic nucleus that coordinates the timing of almost every biological function in your body. Your temperature rises and falls on a cycle. Your blood pressure follows a cycle. Your hormones follow a cycle. And your metabolism, your body's ability to process food, follows a cycle. Here is the key finding that underlies everything else in this video. Your sensitivity to insulin, the hormone that clears sugar from your blood after a meal, is not constant throughout the day. It is highest in the morning and it declines steadily as the day progresses. By evening, the same amount of carbohydrate that your body handles easily at 10 in the morning produces a meaningfully higher blood sugar spike at 8 at night. You did not eat more. You did not eat something different, you just ate it later, and your biology responded differently. This is not a theory. Researchers have confirmed it in human trials using continuous glucose monitoring and direct insulin measurements. A meta-analysis of acute studies found that after identical meals, postprandial glucose and insulin responses were both significantly higher when the meal was eaten at night compared with the same meal eaten during the day. The blood sugar spike is larger, the insulin response is larger and less efficient. And over time, a body that is repeatedly asked to process its largest caloric load at the time of day, when it is least prepared to do so, accumulates a toll that shows up in blood sugar numbers, cholesterol, body weight, and ultimately cardiovascular health. Your peripheral clocks, the local timekeeping systems in your liver, your pancreas, your fat cells, and your muscles are synchronized partly by light and partly by food. When you eat a substantial meal in the morning, you are feeding your peripheral clocks the signal they use to set their own timing. You are telling the whole metabolic system what time of day it is and when to prepare for work. When you eat your largest meal at 9 at night, you are sending a signal that conflicts with what the light environment and the rest of your biology are saying. And a body whose clocks are not synchronized is a body that manages food less efficiently. After 65, this matters more than it did at 40 for reasons that are specific to aging. And I want to spend real time on that because it is the part of this story that most videos and most conversations skip entirely. The first thing that changes after 65 is that your circadian clock itself becomes less robust. This is not optional, and it is not correctable through willpower. The suprachiasmatic nucleus, the brain's master timekeeper, loses cells and signaling strength with age. Your melatonin production declines, your cortisol rhythm flattens, your sleep architecture shifts. The sharp morning peak and the quiet evening trough that characterize a well-calibrated metabolic day become blunted. What this means in practice is that your body's ability to anticipate and prepare for a large meal becomes less reliable. A 65-year-old who eats a large dinner is asking a metabolic system with less scheduling precision to handle a large caloric event at the time of day when it is least prepared. The inefficiency compounds. Blood sugar rises higher and stays elevated longer. The liver has less time to process lipids before sleep. And the sleep that follows a late, large meal is itself disrupted because digestion and the hormones it triggers conflict with the hormones that initiate deep sleep. A randomized crossover trial published in the journal Obesity confirmed the real-world magnitude of this. 93 women with metabolic syndrome were randomized to eat the same total calories across 12 weeks, but one group front-loaded those calories with 700 calories at breakfast and 200 at dinner, while the other group did the opposite, same total, same foods, just reverse timing. The front-loaded breakfast group lost significantly more weight, had greater reductions in fasting glucose and insulin, and saw their triglycerides fall by over 30%. In the dinner-heavy group, triglycerides actually increased. A change of timing alone, no change in what was eaten, produced effects that would be impressive in a medication trial. The second thing to understand is what is specifically happening to your blood sugar when you eat a large meal in the evening, and why the problem is more acute than most people realize. In the morning, your pancreas is primed. Insulin-producing cells called beta cells have been resting overnight and are ready to respond quickly and efficiently. The muscles and liver are insulin-sensitive and ready to absorb and store glucose. Your gut motility is higher, and the hormones that modulate digestion, GLP-1, GIP, and others, are secreted at their strongest circadian peaks. Food processed in this environment is handled efficiently. Blood sugar rises modestly, the response is fast, and the system returns to baseline quickly. By evening, every one of those mechanisms is running at reduced capacity. Beta cell response is slower, muscle insulin sensitivity is lower. The hormonal amplifiers of insulin secretion are at their daily trough. A large dinner does not just produce a higher blood sugar peak. It produces a peak that arrives slowly, stays elevated longer, and clears less completely before sleep begins. And during sleep, your body does not have the activity and muscle uptake that would help clear it. Picture the morning system as a wide, fast-flowing river that handles whatever you put in it. Picture the evening system as a slow, narrow canal. The same volume of water put in at night backs up. The large French prospective study I mentioned at the beginning, the Nutrinet Santé cohort, found that eating a last meal after 9 in the evening versus before 8 was associated with higher cardiovascular risk, and the association was especially strong for cerebrovascular events. The researchers' interpretation is consistent with the mechanism. Chronic repeated disruption of the metabolic circadian rhythm through habitual late eating appears to accumulate a measurable cardiovascular toll over time. I want to be honest that this is observational data and not proof of causation. But the direction of the evidence, from acute postprandial experiments, from randomized timing trials, and from this large prospective study, is consistent and points the same way. Now, here is the piece almost no one discusses, and it is the reason I specifically called out after 65 in this video. It is about muscle, and it changes the simple answer. After 65, one of the most medically significant things happening to your body is sarcopenia, the progressive loss of muscle mass and strength that comes with aging. Sarcopenia is associated with falls, fractures, loss of independence, and earlier death. And one of the most powerful tools for slowing it is dietary protein, consumed in adequate amounts at each meal. Here is the complication. Research on protein timing in muscle in older adults does not point cleanly in the same direction as the metabolic timing research. A study published in Frontiers in Nutrition looked at 219 adults aged 65 and older and compared those who consumed more protein at breakfast to those who consumed more at dinner. The morning protein group showed better muscle mass and grip strength outcomes. When the researchers then did a longitudinal intervention, supplementing 10 grams of milk protein at breakfast in older women who had been under-eating protein in the morning, it produced meaningful improvements in muscle-related measures. What this tells you is that after 65, the distribution of your protein across the day matters as much as the distribution of your total calories. A large dinner that is mostly carbohydrates and alcohol with a light protein-poor breakfast is the worst combination. It sends too much of your energy load to the metabolic system at its weakest point, and it sends too little protein to the time of day when muscle protein synthesis appears to benefit from it most. The emerging picture for people over 65 is not simply eat everything earlier, it is front-load your protein so breakfast carries a real protein hit. Keep your midday meal substantial and make dinner the lightest meal by calorie volume, but not necessarily the lightest by nutrition. Protein at dinner still matters for overnight muscle repair. What you want to avoid is the extreme the research consistently flags as harmful: a very small breakfast, a moderate lunch, and a very large, late carbohydrate-heavy dinner. That pattern misaligns your metabolic clock and starves your muscles of the morning signal they respond to most. The fourth dimension is what happens during the hours after a large, late meal, specifically during sleep, and this is where the cardiovascular and the metabolic story converge most clearly. Your blood pressure follows a circadian pattern called dipping. In healthy adults, blood pressure drops by roughly 10 to 20% during sleep compared with daytime, and this nighttime dip is protective. It gives the cardiovascular system its daily rest and recovery period. Studies have shown that people whose blood pressure does not dip at night, called non-dippers, have significantly higher risks of heart attack and stroke than those who dip, even when their daytime blood pressure is similar. Eating a large meal within 2 to 3 hours of sleep disrupts this dipping pattern. Digestion requires blood flow to the gut and raises sympathetic nervous system activity, both of which maintain or elevate blood pressure at the time when it should be falling. The liver, which should be quietly maintaining stable blood glucose levels overnight, is instead processing a surge of newly absorbed nutrients. Insulin levels are elevated at a time when they should be approaching their daily floor. The hormonal environment that should be quieting down is instead active and reactive. This is one of the clearest physiological reasons why meal timing, not just meal content, affects cardiovascular risk. A dinner of grilled chicken, vegetables, and a modest amount of whole grains eaten at 6 in the evening will produce a very different overnight physiological environment than the identical meal eaten at 9:30. The food is the same. The cardiovascular cost of eating it late is not. So what does all of this mean in practice? And what is the honest answer to the question this video asked? The research points most clearly toward one conclusion. The window between roughly noon and 3 in the afternoon is when your body's metabolic systems are most capable, most insulin sensitive, and best prepared to handle a large caloric meal. Eating your largest meal at midday, what many cultures around the world have done for centuries, is the pattern that aligns most closely with the evidence on circadian biology and metabolic health. The research points away from one pattern specifically: a light breakfast, a moderate lunch, and a large, late dinner eaten close to bedtime. That pattern, which has become common in many Western households after 65, puts the largest caloric load at the time of day when the metabolic system is least equipped to handle it, misaligns the peripheral clocks, disrupts overnight blood pressure dipping, and in older adults specifically delivers protein to the wrong time of day for optimal muscle support. Now, let me be straight about what the evidence does not yet firmly establish, because honesty here matters. Some well-designed, randomized trials that held total calories constant found that the metabolic benefits of eating earlier were attenuated or absent when calorie intake was the same and calorie restriction was the primary driver. This means that the most powerful intervention remains eating the right amount overall. Shifting your meal timing forward will not fully compensate for a diet that is otherwise out of balance. But among people whose total calorie intake is already reasonable and whose main question is about the timing of the largest meal, the research is consistent. Earlier is better, and midday is the best answer. I also want to address a common practical objection because I hear it all the time. Many people over 65 live alone or have social lives that revolve around evening dinners. They share evening meals with family. They have no appetite in the morning. They have been eating dinner as the main event of the day for 50 years, and the idea of reversing this feels impossible. I understand that, and the research does not require a complete reversal. Even a partial shift matters. Moving dinner from 8:30 to 6:30 may be more realistic and more sustainable than moving your biggest meal to noon, and a partial shift still moves the system in a beneficial direction. Some of the benefit is dose-dependent. Let me make this concrete. Consider someone like Eleanor, 68 years old, retired teacher, no major health conditions, but blood sugar numbers that have been edging upward, and a doctor who mentioned at her last visit that her triglycerides were higher than she would like. Eleanor's day looks like this: a cup of coffee and maybe a piece of toast around 8, a sandwich at 1, and then the main event of her day, a full dinner with her husband around 7:30 or 8, after which they watch television, and she usually has a small snack before bed around 10. Eleanor is not eating badly. She is eating a reasonable diet by most measures. But the pattern is the one the research consistently flags. Her largest caloric load comes at the time of day when her metabolic system is at its weakest. Her blood pressure should be winding down, and her muscle-building machinery has already gone without adequate protein since the morning. What a shift looks like for Eleanor is not dramatic. Breakfast becomes a real meal: eggs, some plain yogurt, a handful of nuts. Protein at breakfast means her muscles are getting the morning signal they respond to best. Lunch stays substantial. Dinner moves earlier to 6 if possible and becomes the lighter end of the day: a soup, some fish, vegetables, a smaller portion of carbohydrates. The snack before bed disappears. Nothing in her refrigerator changes. The total calories do not necessarily change. The distribution across the day shifts, and the evidence suggests that over months, her blood sugar and triglycerides will likely respond to that shift. She is still eating with her husband. She is not on a restrictive diet. She has made one structural change to her day, and that change is aligned with what her biology has been asking for. Before I close, 2 clear lines that I want to say plainly. First, if you take diabetes medication or insulin, meal timing directly affects when and how those medications work. Changing the timing or size of your meals without adjusting your medication schedule in parallel can lead to either high or low blood sugar, and either is dangerous. Do not shift your meal pattern significantly without having a specific conversation with your doctor about how to coordinate your medications with the new timing. Second, if your appetite after 65 has become genuinely poor, if eating breakfast feels difficult or unpleasant, this is medically important and worth discussing with your doctor on its own terms. Poor appetite in older adults can be a sign of several things that deserve attention. Do not simply push through a front-loaded eating pattern if eating in the morning is genuinely uncomfortable. Address the appetite question first. Here's the clean answer to the question this video asked. After 65, your biggest meal of the day should ideally be eaten between noon and 3 in the afternoon. The morning is when your insulin sensitivity is highest, your metabolic systems are most efficient, and your blood sugar will handle the same food most cleanly. Midday captures the peak of that window while still being practical for most people. A substantial breakfast with real protein is the second priority, specifically for protecting muscle mass and sarcopenia prevention. And dinner, while not something you need to eliminate or shrink to nothing, should be the lightest caloric meal of the day and finished at least 2 to 3 hours before you sleep so your cardiovascular system gets the overnight dip it needs. None of this requires a new diet. None of it requires unusual foods. It requires redistributing what you are likely already eating across a different structure of the day. Your body's internal clock is running whether you align with it or not. What you are choosing, meal by meal, is whether to work with it or against it. Here is the thread worth pulling next. We spent this video on when your body is most ready to receive food, but there is a companion question about what happens in the 12 to 14 hours after your last meal when you are not eating, and what your body does during that window that may matter for blood sugar, brain health, and longevity. Most people over 65 are unknowingly shortening that window in ways that have metabolic consequences. Understanding what happens during the overnight fast and why the length of it matters is the natural next step from everything we covered today. Take good care of yourself. You are genuinely worth the effort it takes.